Hey everyone, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and today, the rubber meets the road. The proof meets the pudding. We explore the devil in the details. We look at actual imagery taken from Sony's A9 with three of their G Master lenses, the 24-70 2.8, 70-200 2.8, and the announced, but not yet released 100-400mm f 4.5 to 5.6. I shot wide open wherever I could, which I thought was the least forgiving test. No deep depth of field to hide in. We begin with photos, all handheld. Put simply, the A9 is a magnificent sports stills camera with the best autofocus and ergonomics I've yet seen from Sony, along with that insane no blackout 20 frames per second. Its autofocus smokes every camera I've been hands-on with, from Panasonic and Fuji to the Canon 5D2 I had for years. Is it as good as or better than the 1DX2 or the D5? I don't actually know because I haven't used them. Maybe I should. The thing of it is, sports shooting is the most demanding segment of the market I can think of. When I couldn't identify ahead of time a spot in the athlete's motion and his or her position in relation to the surroundings that I wanted to capture, my framing, my lens selection, and even the ability to hold that sucker level were often suboptimal. I can't imagine that being different for any camera out there or yet to be made, at least in my lifetime. As a result, there were times when I cropped tightly and wished for the full 42.3 megapixel sensor of the A7R II and A99 II. But with this said, in any case, I spent little effort editing these images other than cropping, one instance, as you saw, of desaturation, and or a little exposure adjustment. Now, while stressing the frame rate and buffer, I learned there are very pragmatic reasons, not just philosophical and aesthetic, for avoiding spray and pray, even with the A9. Number one, if you hold that shutter button down long enough, it will fill the buffer, and then you're stuck. The buffer will take too long to clear, and you've probably just missed a decisive moment. Two, if you spray and pray, then you'll have to go through all of those in post, thousands of images to get, what, half a dozen, 2 dozen images you really want. The flip side is if your editing software allows you to blow through them quickly, it's like hitting the pause button and then looking at half a dozen images around that pause point. So that's not as bad as I thought. Now, Apple already uses software to identify which of the images from their iPhone burst mode is the best. And I can see the day when this function arrives in professional sports photography too, with frame rates like this. Although, that will be a very sad and frightening day. I can really see that happening. Next up, video. Again, set to aperture preferred, wide open at 4K 24 frames per second, and full auto mode at 1080p in slow motion, still handheld. With no neutral density filters, the shutter speed at 24 frames per second is stupid high, and the resulting jitter is clear. This is a big reason I wish cameras had ISO down to Kodachrome's 25. But the A9's lock-on autofocus in the right circumstances with the right settings is outstanding. I should add that, like the A99II, the Panasonic GH5, recent vintage Canon 5Ds, and the Fuji X-T2, those are the ones I know about, there are now more autofocus parameters from which to choose on all of them, and it's more important than ever before to get them right. Slow motion at 1080p is obviously softer than 4K, but still completely usable and sometimes even beautiful. I found myself thinking this would be especially valuable as a training tool for the athletes and coaches themselves. Then again, autofocus misses in video are much more likely than in stills because you've got so many more scenarios, distances, moving pieces, continuous operation, changing orientations among those pieces, and resulting processing demands. If you've forgotten to change the autofocus parameters, say from locked on to responsive when that change is really called for, well, you can pay a very hefty price. It doesn't look like a $4,500 camera, and you don't look like a professional photographer. In any case, the improvements in ergonomics really show themselves here. The record button and top dial access to S&Q shooting, at least in my book, are big improvements, making the camera much faster in hand and in the field. Now, I wasn't particularly impressed with my video prowess, but my takeaway is pretty straightforward nonetheless. Tripod or monopod mounted, and with another few hours of practice under my belt fine-tuning the autofocus parameters and, more importantly, learning the athlete's movements, the quality of my footage would have risen dramatically, higher than with any other camera I've ever held in hand, even if no camera's autofocus is psychic. Yet. You can argue that the A9 is the camera Sony should have launched back in 2013 when they first announced the full-frame E-mount line. Better battery life, better ergonomics, better autofocus, better blah-de-blah-de-blah-blah-blah. On the other hand, you could argue instead that Sony didn't have the tech back then, maybe the will, but has shown an industry-leading ability to put themselves into the market, listen to market feedback, push their technology as hard as possible, this is especially in electronics in the sensor arena, and respond quickly. You can argue that Sony should have put in the 42.3 megapixel sensor, S-Log, and picture profiles they already had, and charged the same price, around $3,000, instead of jacking it 50% higher with the $4,500 price tag they've hung on it. Or you could argue that Sony simply doesn't yet have the ability to offer that much speed and resolution at anywhere near the price point, if at all. Or that it wants to avoid cannibalizing sales of its almost $1,000 higher, dedicated interchangeable lens video camera, the FS5. That is, if it wants to have enough profit to keep reinvesting in rapid product iteration and innovation. This race to zero in the imaging industry is frightening to manufacturers and photographers, videographers, DPs, everyone in the ecosystem. You can argue that Sony should have released a couple of high-speed super telephoto primes at the same time. Otherwise, the camera is useless to top-end sports photography pros. Or you could argue that Sony was smart by introducing an optically superb, if slower, 4x zoom with an ease of use and price point accessible to many more photographers, giving it time to ramp up, as and when the market demands it, those Boku bucks primes like a 300 2.8 or 500mm f4, which Sony just happens to have right now in its A-mount lineup, accessible to E-mount users with full phase detect autofocus via their $400 LAEA-EIOU 4 adapter. You can argue that even when the price of an A9 body undercuts the Canon's 1DX2 and Nikon's D5 by $1,000 or $2,000, the cost of switching is dramatically higher and therefore a non-starter. Or you could argue that Sony has made the cost of switching as low as it can while remaining prudent and, interestingly, humble about its ability to read the market. Or perhaps that the biggest audience for this camera consists of the folks about to move up to this level, and we're going to have to buy big glass anyway. And actually, would be better served by a wide focal range zoom as they learn where to put themselves in relation to the action on the field, in the pool, on the court, in the ring. You get the point. What else? Oh yeah, just a couple more. Right. You can argue that camera design, the user experience, front and center, is not in Sony's DNA. It is, after all, an electronics company and now media company, entertainment company, that acquired a camera company, Konica Minolta, and has thus really only been in the business a decade or two. You can further argue that they should really get going on that, including, just maybe, acqui-hiring a company like Filmic Pro on the software side, and I don't know who on the hardware side, to make cameras that are as instinctive to use as the Fuji X-T2 or iPhone are to me. Yeah. You can argue that Sony's IBIS should be better. Yeah. What I think is beyond argument is that Sony is tremendously ambitious, has adopted an au courant tactic of applying agile software methodologies to hardware development, making investments, taking some risks, being very smart about its marketing, and at the end of the day, delivering one heck of a challenge to the top guns in the sports photography world. I think the A9 really is a DSLR killer. But then again, I think the best pros are already using what works for them. If some decide to switch to the A9, I can see why. If some choose to stay with what has become as familiar to them as an old sweater, really, I get that too. Because in the end, it's never just about the gear. In sports photography especially, it's about the flow between a man or woman and his equipment. That just doesn't sound right. In reality, I think top sports photographers could take amazing shots with an iPhone. Then again, they'd probably get trampled, pummeled, or flattened in the process and annoy the crap out of the athletes, coaches, audience, and advertisers. As for me personally, well, I'm not a sports photographer, even if I was inspired back in the day by Lois Greenfield and personally photographed ballet and modern dancers captured mid-flight. And I neither need that speed nor have the desire and wherewithal to drop $4,500 on a single camera. And the one image I'd actually will print, and put on my wall is a dark, noisy photograph of an athlete walking away from the camera after the competition has ended. But that's just me. Your mileage may vary. If you like what you've seen here today, give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below. Always excellent. If you've found this useful, entertaining, or inspiring, please consider using our affiliate links and maybe even dropping a $5 to us in the link at the bottom so we can do more of this kind of thing. We love it and we want to do more. For 3 Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. See you next time.